Alright, today I wanted to talk about Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. And Tigana's a fantasy book. I think it was written in 1990, and I finally got around to reading it because it's kind of been one of those, the way I used to find fantasy books to read, the next fantasy book to read was I would go online and Google like the top 10 fantasy books, and for a long time this one has been on most lists will have this one, or at least a novel by Guy Gavriel Kay. But most of the time it is specifically Tigana. And so I finally got around to reading it, or actually listening to it on the way back and forth as I go to and fro, listening to it on audio, and I wanted to talk about it. So specifically the aspect that I thought was really cool that he did was this idea of manipulating the audience. And I say manipulating because it'll become apparent when we go through this one kind of what specifically he does, because he really makes you feel for a character who doesn't deserve it. And there's kind of this sense of I almost felt a sense of betrayal or sorts towards the end, because kind of the ending is very, very powerful. And I kind of want to talk about what leads up to it and kind of what are the key points that Kay is using in order to get there. So obviously spoiler alerts, because we're going most of the way through the novel kind of talking about it. So our story begins in this place called the Palm. So basically this refers to a whole bunch of little city-states, basically kind of little not peninsulas, but a bunch of little provinces, basically. I haven't actually seen a map for it, so I don't really know what they all look like, but I think there's 9 provinces total. Yeah, something like this. And basically what we're talking about is Tigana, we'll just pick Tigana, is one of these provinces. And the story begins with basically a war. Tigana, the province of Tigana, or the city-state, or the country, if you will. They're kind of like, it's very much based off of and influenced by Italy. So medieval Italy, kind of when before Italy was united as one nation. They kind of were all there's these little city-states where they were kind of divided up into each other, fighting against each other. So we're talking about specifically about Tigana, who is fighting an invading force. And then we get introduced kind of by distance to one of our main villains, the tyrant. So this is an R. So it's Brandin of Ygrath is invading, and he is a magician. And so we're also kind of introduced to the idea of what sort of magic are we dealing with. The way I kind of categorize it, or people seem to categorize it, as kind of soft versus hard magic. So you kind of have Harry Potter up here in terms of hard magic, so very defined rules, and you can kind of see its aspect on everyday life, and kind of Lord of the Rings, basically, where it's much more of a softer, where you don't really know exactly how the magic works, but you can kind of see them kind of pushing their influence or doing this or something like that. And the magic is very much muted. It's still very powerful, but it's very much muted. You know, Gandalf can't zap a lightning bolt, Avada Kedavra, the ring wraiths down. He has to wait until they get close enough to Rivendell, and then with Elrond, they use the horses, the waves, to create, this rushing current, which drives away the ring wraiths, and probably normally would have killed them. But of course, they're ring wraiths, so they didn't die. So this is kind of what you call hard and soft. Tigana is very much in the soft aspect. So it's kind of this nebulous, powerful force that you don't really know where it came from, and nobody really fully understands it. Now, it is a little bit more common than there, so it's probably like a little bit snudge up here as opposed to what you would expect. But either way, so we got Brandin of Ygrath is invading, and he's fighting against the prince and the army of Tigana and these forces, and they're trying to stand up for freedom from there. So this sets the scene, and then we basically fast forward, because Tigana loses, and what you have now is basically the entire area of the Palm is basically kind of stuck between these, what are called the 2 tyrants. And the 2 tyrants are, so you have Brandin of Ygrath, who's king of the Ygrathans, basically, who are just some distant foreign country that came over and invaded. And then you have, we'll put him over here, is Alberico, which is, he is a representative. So he's not a king, he's kind of like a head general of the empire known as, Barbadior. I always heard it as Barbadia, but Barbadior. which is kind of a, I don't know what you call it, like almost a, I guess I got a bit of a Mongolian kind of northern Africa, like Tunisia, maybe the Carthaginian sort of vibes, basically, where they're kind of very much distinctly different culturally from the Palm. At least that's how it always kind of presented. So basically, these are the two forces that are kind of at play. And both of them have ginormous armies and incredible, incredible power. And also, both of them are magicians. So Alberico is also a magician. And this is where we begin. And so now, this is kind of to set the stage. So this is where we're at. This is kind of the two vying villains that are at play here. And then we're introduced to our main character, who's a Mr. Devon. And he grew up on a little farm. And then turns out he's actually amazing at singing. So he joins up with a troupe of singers and minstrels and dancers and all that thing like that. And so they are going through everything, and he actually ends up going and playing for, there's the Duke of Astabar. We'll put it up here. The Duke Sandre de Astabar is dead. He's the old duke who finally died, and he was conquered by Alberico. So basically Sandre Astabar is ruled by Alberico and the Barbadiors. So Sandre is dead, and basically they're playing for his funeral rites. And so what they do is basically there's this whole, you get to understand the characters and the dynamics. You know, they have this guy, can't remember if he goes by a code name. It's been a little bit since I read the beginning of the book. But there's a guy named Alessan who's a really good, he plays the pipes. Yeah, I believe he plays the pipes. Alessan, and there's Catriona, who is another singer. And there's the other guy who I can't remember, but the guy who runs the show from there. And basically Devon is well known, or he's kind of becoming well known, and he's very well respected in the troupe because he has an amazing voice. Like, he doesn't even have to try. He's an incredible, incredible musician. And so what you have is this whole, this dynamic. They're going here and they're playing for it. And then Devon basically follows Catriona when she's sneaking up into a place. And she's getting really pissed because they kind of have this hate relationship, love-hate, more like a hate-hate relationship. They kind of rivalry. Well, she'll do jerk things to him, and he'll kind of needle her back, and kind of this back-and-forth relationship between the two of them. Alessan is like 30 plus. Catriona is about the same age, so like 20-ish, 21. So that's kind of the dynamics from there. And so they go up he follows her because after they've played and sung for this funeral rite, everyone's deeply moved. It's apparently very, very famous. Everyone is just absolutely overwhelmed by how good and how well done Devon did, and how good, basically, they were able to sing this funeral rites. So they go up into this room, and he follows her, and then in this room, she's really pissed that he came and followed her, and he's like, what are you doing up here? And she's like, what are you doing up here? And then it turns out then that a bunch of other men are coming and following after them. And so what you have is basically they both hide. Turns out Catriona knows where a secret passageway is, which, begins to start to ask all of these questions. How does she know that there's a secret passageway? Anyway, so they're in there, and you get the idea that Catriona is trying to keep him from overhearing. So she seduces him. They have sex, and also he's super, A-okay with it because she is very lovely. But he does end up overhearing the plot because you get the idea she's very much trying to keep him from overhearing whatever is being talked about. And it turns out they're talking about a hunting lodge. And he overhears some of it, but particularly overhears the hunting lodge part. And then they leave, the men leave, and then they leave, and they kind of have this awkward, do we talk about it, do we not talk about it from here? And there's this kind of this tension kind of building between them, because it's like, are we now lovers? Are we friends? Do we hate each other? Like, what was that all about? And so this is kind of the beginning, helping set the beginning stage. So we have a lot of good things going on. So we have a lot of action to start off our story. We have the tyrants. We're introduced to two villains, basically in terms of the tyrants, which is really good. I will talk a little bit more about this, but how nice it is for the story that there's two villains and what that does. Because you could think about it where it could have just been one villain, but because that there's two, it really adds a lot of play and dynamics and kind of the power struggle that you can do between the two of them, as opposed to just having one, which really changes a bunch of things. So the hunting lodge, and then basically then they go into fast forward later. So we're going to the hunting lodge, and Devon has, of course, he's like, I'm gonna sneaky up there and see what's going on. And so he goes up here and hides in the rooftop loft of this hunting lodge. And here we go. All right, and then a bunch of people meet, and it turns out that it's actually the prince, so Sandre's son, Tomas, and some other powerful dukes and lords of the realm are in this hunting lodge, along with Sandre's dead body. So the body is here, and then a bunch of other lords are just hanging out. And basically they start talking, and you kind of get a narrator's perspective from this part, where you realize that Tomas is gay, and this caused a huge rift of hatred between Sandre and Tomas. They basically hated each other. But it turns out also, kind of in that, kind of capturing the same irony as, Tyrion does, where Tywin wants a son like him, and it's Tyrion who he hates. So it's kind of this idea of Sandre wishes that he had a son that could kind of be conniving and smart and all these other traits, because it turns out his other sons and other family members are all basically completely useless. And they're just not great. Everyone except for Tomas, who he hates. And so what you see is they talk about over time is that this hatred slowly turns into just a cold, distant respect. They basically just don't talk about it no matter what. Tomas starts playing the role of the gay dandy, this prince who's all about pleasure. So he can kind of have this cover. He uses, a fake voice. He does all of this basically because they're trying to plot and overthrow Alberico. Because Alberico's got spies everywhere. There was a chance they tried to kill him once. And they failed, and Alberico basically, they tried to poison food at some restaurant, and so Alberico basically had everyone in the restaurant killed, and then everyone who's affiliated with the restaurant killed, and tortured to death and killed. So basically, he is incredibly crude, also cruel, very efficient, and practical in terms of leader. You got to kill all the people who try to kill you. So this is what they're doing, and basically Tomas is meeting here and says, hey, I've summoned these two other dukes, Duke 1 and Duke 2, I think they're both dukes. Other powerful lords. You just call them other powerful lords, plus Tomas, because we are here, and then plus another guest that we don't know about. We're here to plot because we're going to overthrow Alberico. And are you two in? The two dukes are like, yeah, sure, let's see your plan, though. And what happens is basically then there is another man who shows up in the window, and it turns out that it is Alessan, because remember, Devon, this is all told from Devon's point of view, and he is up in the rooftop. Turns out Alessan's there, and you're like, what? Why is he here? Turns out Alessan is not just a musician. He's actually someone far more important. He doesn't really reveal who he is, but you have this aspect. And then what you have next is, it turns out, there is, I think like a cousin or something is also there, but it turns out the cousin has betrayed them. So basically Alberico now shows up here and completely surrounds them and captures all of them with all of his 100x soldiers, because you aren't even allowed to have weapons in the province from here. So Alberico has everything completely under lockdown. He has spies. And it turns out that one of their family members betrayed them to Alberico. And so what happens here is, this is really, I did like this scene, because what we have here is okay, as the audience, think of this in terms of what is the audience supposed to feel. So we're introduced to a land. It's a nice land, and they're invaded by tyrants. So we immediately sympathize with Tigana, basically the losers, the underdog. The people who aren't being invaded and murdered and killed. It's natural. We would sympathize with them. We were kind of introduced to these two tyrants from here. We're introduced to Devon, and he's staying in this land. We don't really have a strong connection with Sandre or Tomas, but we have this sympathy for him. We have a lot of sympathy for Tomas because of his father. His father absolutely hated him because he was gay, and you have all this other aspects going on where they never liked each other. They never talked, never said, basically all this tension. But then they put that aside, or Sandre, puts that aside in order to work with his son because his son is very clever. Turns out that all the best qualities of him in terms of his intellect and power and all this other thinking and scheming all made it into Tomas, who he hates. So they kind of build this bond. And so what we have here at the audience is we have a lot of sympathy. So we are on the side of Tomas. Because one, we have a tyrant, against him. We have this sympathy for this character. We want them to succeed from here. And this is kind of what we want to happen from here. And so this is what you want to see happen. So what we've got here now is we're at this hunting lodge. Alberico shows up, basically starts saying, hey, I knew all of what was going on. Someone betrayed you. So the Duke finds out that it's like some cousin or some idiot guy who does it. He kills the cousin, immediately murders him. And the Barbadians then kill Duke 1. And then another Duke, I think the other day they kill him, or he starts trying to kill Alberico. They kill him. And then there's another guy, I can't remember, some old guy. I don't remember. He's supposed to be like a priest or something like that. It turns out he's secretly a magician and uses like lightning blasts against Alberico. And this is a good point, because this is a good part where when you have a villain who's supposed to be really powerful, and it turns out that the good guys, as it were, are really smart, but the enemy still wins, you have to find a way to cleverly balance that. Because if the enemy just is so overpowered, then one of two things happen. One, you don't think that the allies can ever win. They can't win. Or two, when they do win, it's actually a false or forced win, because, if Anakin Skywalker is, day one Jedi, fights against Darth Sidious and wins, we know that it's cheap. It didn't actually happen. It's the plot. It's some other stupid force, because with the eternal logic of the world, that shouldn't happen. So what you want to make sure is that your enemy is still defeatable. You can still defeat them, but he's just very powerful. So that way, if you do defeat them, it actually seems legitimate. Because if somebody's just overpowered in every sort of way, then okay, how do you defeat them? And this is kind of asks this question. So he shoots a lightning bolt, and Alberico dodges it. So this is kind of one of those things where it's like, oh man, you really thought he was going to take out Alberico. But there is a cost. So Alberico lives, but he does some magic jutsu, which leaves him weakened, basically. His magical power is forever weakened, which is a great way to do it. This is kind of like, in Orochimaru versus the third Hokage, whichever one, where third Hokage does this huge gamble to kill Orochimaru, who's the villain, is evil ninja guy. And then he fails, but then he settles. He goes, okay, well, and instead of it being a complete loss, which would just be, hey, the villain won and defeated everything because he was trying to kill the third Hokage, it turns out that he keeps Orochimaru, he ruins his ninjutsu. He keeps him from using the magic in that world. So he takes away his magic forever. So there still is a loss, even though they didn't kill Orochimaru. And of course, he's going to try and get his power back later. But there's at least some sort of cost. There is some sort of victory from the side of our allies. So we have this in an aspect, and it works out from there. So Alberico then kills the wizard guy, kills the two dukes, and basically the only one left from here is Tomas, because Alessan darts out. He escapes, basically. They are out of there. They escape. He reveals Devon and says Devon working for Alessan, and Devon plays along. But they escape and get out of there because they can see that somebody's heading that way. So they manage to sneak out and get away from everything. And so what happens then is basically Alberico captures Tomas and basically kills everyone else. So he's completely foiled these years and years of planning by Sandre, who, again, is dead. And he also planned it to happen because, hey, this is the only time we'll be able to get together for a good excuse is on my funeral from here. So this is kind of what happens. So basically it is a high blow. So again, if we're thinking of terms of where is the audience from this point, we have all these high hopes because this great plan. Tomas is a great planner. They have this wonderful plan that lets them all get together, but then it just comes crashing down to the ground. So it explodes basically, and everything falls apart. So from there, but then, and Alberico captures Tomas and they leave, and Tomas is going to get tortured and interrogated from there. But then it turns out, and Devon and Alessan come back. But then it turns out that Sandre is actually not dead. He comes back to life. Turns out he's been faking his death. And he knew about Alessan and everything like that. And Alessan's, how do you know about me? Because he's, again, some secret person. And so Sandre's like, yep, I knew about you, and I knew you would want to work with us to help take down the tyrants. And Alessan says something here that you have to take down both tyrants. I want to kill Brandin of Ygrath, but we have to do both tyrants. You have to get both of them. Because if you take out one, the other's just going to conquer the rest of it. Basically, kind of the two tyrants keep themselves in check, but if you take out one, then the other is just going to invade, and it's not going to be that much, not that different, basically, from there. So this is what we've got so far. So again, thinking of the audience's perspective, what you have here is you have this sort of deal where it's, okay, we have hope. We have this plan. We have all of this. It comes crashing down. Basically, you have all this hope, and then it comes crashing down to the ground, and everything falls apart. But then you kind of have another upswing, which is, again, you don't want to completely crush the audience. You want to give them, say, okay, these villains are big time, but the good guys still have a chance. There's still something that they can play into it. And what turns out is Sandre is alive. And it also turns out that Alessan is, as he begins to explain to Devon, is that he is from Tigana. And Devon's like, what's that? And he goes, okay, well, once upon a time when Brandin of Ygrath comes in and destroys Tigana, his son died. Stevan, I think is the son's name. He dies. And with his death, Brandin goes into such uncontrollable grief that he kills everyone from Tigana that he can find. He scatters everything. They destroy the cities. They block everything. And he uses his magic so that no one can even remember the name of Tigana. So basically, even if you said Tigana to someone, they couldn't hear it. So just the whole name itself is gone. Hints from here. I'm from blank. What? And it turns out that Devon is from Tigana because he recognizes, there's a tune. His father is from Tigana, which is why he can hear it. And so basically, and that Alessan is the prince of Tigana, and he's going to take down the tyrants and come back and free his homeland from there. And so what you have is basically, this is kind of the initial setting. And this is like the first 100 pages, 50 to 100 pages. So this is quite an intro of, ups and downs and everything like that. So basically what we have, though, is we have the little guy. You basically have the heroes, and they have their quest up here to defeat the evil tyrants from here. So their plan is from here, and they've got Sandre, who then turns out is also a magician. Even though he's not from Tigana, because he's a magician, he can hear the name Tigana. He's been secretly living out as a magician because he's also not that powerful. So he's like, I just kept it hidden because it wouldn't really make much of a difference because he's nowhere near as powerful as Brandin and Alberico, and they kill any magician that they can find. And so he sneaks down and kills Tomas, who's in jail, so that way Tomas doesn't get tortured to death and give them up. So it's kind of a mercy killing from there. So what we have here is, again, think of what it is from the audience. So we have some good guys and we have some bad guys, and we have this quest to free the land, basically. This is what is set up, and this is firmly established as a good thing. And all of this, if it starts to sound kind of painfully obvious from this point, this is kind of what I wanted to talk about, because this is what Kay really does a great job of with this story specifically, in terms of flipping some stuff on his head. He's manipulating the audience to this point. So we have the heroes, we have the villains, and we have the quest to free the land, basically. So everyone's on the same page. But what we start to see as the story goes on, so basically the next section of the story is basically Alessan working towards this quest of how to free Tigana. And then we're also introduced to another character whose name is Dionora. Turns out, so Alessan has a BFF named Baird, who's great. I really liked him. And they're both from Tigana. And Baird's like just working with Alessan. They're best friends and have been for the past 20 years since they were kids. Baird's a really good warrior and a fighter and all this other stuff. Dionora is Baird's sister. And she goes to the island where Brandin the tyrant who destroyed her homeland lives, and she became one of his courtesans, basically, the concubine, basically. Courtesan. Of course, she hid the fact that she is from Tigana, because if she was, she ever revealed that, so she would be killed. So she says she is from Certando, I think. Certando, one of these places, basically, one of the provinces. So she's from Certando, and she becomes one of his concubines from here. And so what we have is basically we have now a perspective, because up until this point we have Alberico's perspective, and he's kind of like fairly straightforward. Just, I'm here, I'm going to rule, and I'm going to kill and murder and torture anyone who stands in my way. End of story. And so now we get to see the other tyrant, which is Brandin of Ygrath. And so what we have at this point is basically you get a different point of view. And it turns out, though, that over time we start to see she wants to kill Brandin, but then you start to understand that, hey, she's actually kind of helping him. She becomes his lover, of course, sleeping with him. But then also you begin to understand she also starts to fall in love with Brandin. And so what you start to see is you start to see this point of view. So again, what does this do to the audience? We're introduced to Dionora as a very sympathetic character. She's a young girl. She basically has to become a prostitute to make her way up. And then finally, until she's going with the single goal of killing Brandin, because he destroyed her homeland and murdered everyone she loved. So you have this idea of this is the point of view. So this is, we're for her, we like her, and we like her mission. So this is the part from here that we're going to see begin to change. So hold that thought. We're going to jump back to Alessan then. Alessan is this, does a few things that happen, because again, this is the good guys. These are the good guys. But then some things happen that begin to make us, the audience, question this. So what you have is you have a few of these comments where, or basically they come across and they meet another wizard, it turns out, who's named Erlein di Senzio, from one of the, again, Senzio is up here, one of the other provinces, Senzio. And Alessan, turns out the princes of Tigana have this power to enslave wizards and force them to do whatever they say. So he enslaves Erlein di Senzio and says, hey, we need your help to free the land. And Erlein obviously is not happy about this. So, and basically it's actually even quite heartbreaking, kind of cruel, it seems like, where he tries to free himself and he tries to fight against this enslavement, but he can't. He has to do whatever Alessan says. And so what you start to see is you start to see the graying. Basically what you start presenting with is you start seeing this whole aspect of Alessan and his quest, and the quest for Tigana starts to go from, kind of a good guy white to a bit more of a gray. You start to see this slowly through the story, because again, they're still doing good. They're not doing anything super evil, but you start to see like, okay, is it worth it? Is this the goal? And again, all of this is intentional from the author's perspective. All of this is very, very intentional at this point. My exposure got upset again. All of this is very, very intentional up to this point where they're saying, hey, this is the good guy, this is the bad guy, but then we start to see it graying out. You even have some comments like, hey, Alberico, everything is so much safer since Alberico took over, because he would murder literally anyone who stood against him. Even the bandits won't do against this one. So Alberico is actually not the worst leader. Maybe he's horrible in his campaign to take over the country, but it turns out he may not be the worst leader. Just don't go against him, and you can kind of do whatever you want from here. And this is kind of this idea. And then we're introduced to another idea where Alessan has this plan to basically send up in the province of Senzio. We're going to provoke a fight between Alberico and Brandin, and they're going to fight in the little province of Senzio. And Erlein di Senzio is not happy with this, not only because he's still enslaved, but two, because it's going to result in a lot of death. A lot of people in Senzio are going to die. They didn't ask for this, they didn't choose this, and it's Alessan's fault that this is going to be happening. And so what we start seeing is a lot more of this gray area aspect is coming into the picture. And also from here, then we jump back to Dionora. And what you have is then Dionora, somebody tries to kill Brandin, and Dionora saves his life. You know, she jumps in the way of the crossbow bolt, and it's like, blah. And she managed to save it because it was an assassination attempt. And what you realize, and she realizes, is that she is fully in love with Brandin. She loves him. She loves him. And now she can barely live with herself because she's now saved the life and fallen in love with the man that she hates. Or the man she's supposed to hate, but she's actually falling in love with. And again, this is from Dionora's point of view. Dionora, we like Dionora. So now we trust her judgment. And so we start seeing Brandin in this, beginning to see him in this different light. Because it's basically, we start seeing this, okay, comparing him naturally to Alessan, who's kind of becoming a little bit more gray. So basically you start asking the questions of, do we really want to enslave people and cause all these people in Senzio to die in order to kill Brandin, in order to remove the tyrants? Are we just replacing the tyrant with another? You know, what is the point with this? And so you start to see this whole dilemma begin to come up in the audience, and it's kind of subtle. It's kind of subtle from here, and it's one of those things which Kay doesn't dissuade. You know, he could easily dissuade this, as we will see, especially as we get to the end. He could dissuade this easily if he want. I mean, he's the author; he can make anything happen, but he doesn't, because Brandon's kind of just ruling, and everything's just kind of keeping to stable. And so then what happens is Brandin, then after his assassination attempt, he abdicates the throne of Ygrath, says, "I am now one of the Palm," and he's going to marry Dionora. And so Dionora basically says, okay, so the only way that we can make this whole Brandin becoming, you know, the king work is what you have to have is do this thing called the ring dive. And it's this ancient tradition in the Palm where someone throws a little tiny ring off into the sea. And let's see. And you have to find the ring and go get it. And if you find it, it means the gods fortune you, love you, and all this stuff. And if you don't, then the gods don't like you. So it's kind of this huge risk, and you could drown. And if you fail, you get exiled. That's the other thing. So they throw the ring into the sea, and then somebody has to go after and get it. And as you may imagine, a ring is very small. And so diving into the sea is going to be very difficult. And so she says, hey, and this is kind of a husband and wife thing. Usually it's done if you, in history, in the culture of the time, if you did succeed in the ring dive, you would get wealth and riches, and the gods loved you, and all the people believed in this thing. And so what you have is Dionora says, I'll do the ring dive, and then if we win, then this will rally all the people of the Palm together, and then we can go fight Alberico, because Alessan has arranged for Alberico to come up right up to the border of Senzio. He's right up at the border. He's not going in, he's just very hesitant. He's right up there. So, and then what they do is they do this ring dive, and which is kind of described as, because again, everything with Brandin and everything with this is told from Dionora's perspective, her point of view. We like her, we trust her judgment, and she's starting to come around on Brandin. So what you have then is the audience is slowly coming around to Brandin. We're starting to, you know, he's not evil. Maybe he's not good, but we start to see a little bit more moral grayness coming from Alessan in this whole aspect. So this is where you really begin to see pushing the audience and pulling them and kind of going in these different ways. All of this is very intentional from Kay, from the author, and this is what it is. So keep an eye out for this in terms of your stories that you guys are reading or looking at them. You should always have an idea for what the audience should be doing. Not everyone is going to be doing that, but there is an idea that you can get like, oh, okay, this is what's supposed to happen, or this is what you're supposed to feel from here. So they toss the ring in there, and basically Dionora dives, and she goes, okay, I'm going to kill myself. She's going to commit suicide, and the reason why is because she can't live with herself, because she loves the man who murdered all of her family, and she can't do this. It's basically horrifying to her. She doesn't want to She doesn't want to live with herself for that. So she dives down. She's swimming. She's like, I'm just going to swim as far down as I can until I die. And so she starts diving, and then she goes, well, might as well try and find the ring. And then she goes, and she actually does find the ring. And she just keeps swimming down and down and down. And she's like, I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to just die. I'm going to let this happen. And I'm not going to... Brandon will die because everyone's going to think he's unlucky, and this is just, everything's going to fall apart. And then she sees something, and she begins to see signs and everything, and you see that there's a change in her perspective, and then she comes back out of the water. And at this point, right before she emerges from the water, we're looking at, from Alessan's point of view, and Devon, as they're watching Brandon, and he's this stoic-faced man who's completely ignoring the fact that the woman he's supposed to love has just dived down. But when she emerges from the ocean, you begin to see it, and you see him completely break down and cry. Basically, he is actually in love with her. He actually does love her. He genuinely does. He was so terrified that she was going to die, and she comes back, and he cradles her in his arms, and it's this really, really powerful, and everyone in the entire town is like, holy cow, this woman is amazing. She's absolutely beautiful, and she did this whole thing. She took this huge risk for the man that she loves, and it's this powerful story. And so again, we start to see this change in the audience. We start to feel this change, and even in Alessan, he's trying to figure out what's going on. How is it that this man who is so evil to destroy Tigana, the one that we've hated, the man that we've devoted our entire lives, Alessan's past 20 years of his life has been to overthrowing and trying to defeat this tyrant. How can this happen? And so what you start to see a lot of turmoil going up in the audience. Again, we are manipulating the audience. This is kind of what we're doing and what this is causing. And so what it is basically we start to make this even more ambiguous. We're like, do we really want to do this? There's even that question you begin to have. Like, do we even want to overthrow the tyrant? Is there this big problem or that big problem? What's going on? And so what you have happen then is then Brandon gets Dionora, and he rallies the palm, because the palm is like, hooray, you successfully did the ring dive, which means that you successfully did the ring dive, which means the gods are on your side. So then at this point, then, Brandon is secure in his position in the palm, but Alberico still hasn't invaded Senzio. So this is kind of stalemate. And this is where Catriona goes and sneaks in and does something, again, kind of like sleeping with Devon. She does another thing that is very abrasive and bold and going out on a limb. And so she assassinates a Barbadian, one of Alberico's, his emissary, basically, and assassinates them and says, long live King Brandon. And so obviously everyone's like, okay, we can put that together. And so basically Alberico invades Senzio, and Brandon has to then fight back. And so this kind of goes back to Alessan's original plan, which is you need to play both tyrants against each other. So we've successfully done this, and Brandon and Alberico are now fighting. And again, you're seeing everything from Brandon's perspective, from Dionora's point of view, who we trust, who we like. We're not seeing it from Brandon justifying himself. We're seeing it from an outside point of view. And so what you now have is you now realize, and Brandon's the underdog. So basically it's 3-2-1. They're fighting on these mountains, basically, from here. And what you have is you have Brandon over here and Alberico under here, and you have 3 times the troops versus 1 times the troops. And they're fighting in this valley area and killing them. And basically Brandon's magic is overpowering Alberico's magic. And the magic here is fairly nebulous, where they're just kind of like, it means that your men are easier to kill or something. And Alberico's trying to fight off against Brandon's power, but he's really failing. It's not succeeding. He's not doing a great job of it. He's just, because of, again, this assassination attempt that left him weakened forever. He did dodge the magic attack that was trying to assassinate him, but it cost him a lot. And this is really coming back to pay. And so now what we have is we're in this interesting position where we have these 2 evil people, supposedly evil people, fighting against each other. Who do you root for? Who are you going for? Who do you hope to win? You have the underdog, and we really start to see sympathy for Brandon and hoping he wins. Because Alberico is not... He's just kind of a thug. Like, that's kind of basically it. He doesn't have any philosophy. There's no greater culture or anything aspect from that. He just kills anyone who stands in his way, and that's it. And so he's kind of presented as this really ruffian thug from here, because he's not like Brandin. Brandin is the type of man who can make a woman fall in love with him. Not only that, a woman like Dionora, who will do the ring dive for him. She will make him fall in love with her. And so you have this real sympathy for Brandin. And basically what happens then is Alessan and all the wizards and stuff like that, Alessan, and they get a few Sandre and Erlein, who are, again, wizards, and some other wizards and stuff. They start helping Alberico by going against Brandin to keep it basically even, because what they're trying to do is they want both tyrants to kill each other. And just as they're about to lose, they get more help, and they really help Brandin do this. And Brandin goes, okay, I'm losing, and I can no longer do this, because seemingly, despite all the odds, despite how powerful Brandin is, it's basically like 8v1. And again, we have this underdog aspect, where this moral grayness, where, hey, they're ganging up on Brandin. So you have this sympathy. All this is playing into effect. And then Brandin basically does, okay, I'm going to kill Alberico as my last shot. And the armies have almost kind of wiped each other out, but his army's kind of winning. So basically he does an Avada Kedavra blast, or whatever you want to call it, and kills Alberico. And right at the very end, before they, the other wizards, Sandre and all of them, are keeping Brandin from down, right before they abandon Alberico and leave him for the 1v1 fight, Sandre basically goes, hey, Alberico, remember when you murdered my son? Bam! Take this. And so he gets Avada Kedavra, and Brandin uses all of his magics. He has 0 out of 0 mana now. And at this point then, the spell that was binding Tigana fades. And it turns out, and this is the part with the twist, because remember, let's summarize where we are. Brandin was this tyrant. He's supposed to be this evil guy, but we begin to see this change come into effect, and everything starts to change, and we start to have sympathy for him. All of this is done for Dionora. Brandin has never asked for sympathy. He's never said, I'm a good man. He says, I am just what I am, basically. And so we start seeing this, and we start seeing the sympathy, and Brandin at the last moment kills Alberico. And this is the part where I'm talking about the manipulation of the audience, where I felt very manipulated. And kind of at the end of Tigana, I was so conflicted, because I was kind of annoyed and angry with the author because of what he did. And what it turns out is his fool was actually the guy who's like dumb and mute, is actually the prince who killed his son. He's the Prince Valentina, or Tino, of Tigana, who Brandin tortured and broke and brutalized until he became basically a complete shell of a man, and tortured him to such a degree that all he could do, that almost everything of his personality and everything was gone, until there was just a sliver left of himself, so he could watch Brandin destroy his homeland completely and erase it from memory. And you realize this at the very end, that this is who the fool is. This is a man that Brandin has been actively torturing with the memory of his land, of what he's going to do to his people to destroy it, for the past 20 years. And all of a sudden, this snapback kind of occurs, where what you have is, you have this guy who we thought was a good person. For all this, it just snaps back, and you realize he is evil. Like, that is some evil, evil stuff. That is absolutely evil. To torture a guy to the point where he becomes deaf and mute, and then to keep him alive. He doesn't kill him, he keeps him alive, and he won't let him kill himself. He keeps him alive. And so suddenly you start to see, because we were judging Alberico because he was going to torture Tomas and do all of this for him. But then it turns out Brandin's been actively torturing this guy for 20 years. Just mocking him, basically letting him live with the knowledge that Brandin is going to stay and live, and Tigana is going to become a fading memory, and just everything evaporates. And this is where, and the reason why it worked is because we were so told from Dionora's point of view. And there is kind of a semblance of the justice, because now that the magic has fallen, and Valentino, I can't remember, he kills Brandin, and then Valentino dies. So basically Brandin then dies, and Valentina dies, and then Dionora, again, swims off into the ocean and kills herself. Which is it's really tragic. Her story is it really just feels like such a tragedy at the end. And so what you have is you're left at the end where before you were kind of like not quite sure if Brandon was as bad of a guy. And then right up at the very end, once they fully discover, defeat Brandon, basically, with all the magic, all their plans coming into fruition, you realize, holy cow, this guy is legit. This is evil. This guy is evil. But it really makes me feel so manipulated because all this point, we're having all this ambiguity with Alessan, enslaving Senzio, and Senzio saves Catriona, so they freeze him and they kind of make up. And you can kind of see Kay, the author, preparing to kind of begin this split, because then everything starts to come around. You start to see the lord, the old lord of Senzio, says, yes, we're going to use my homeland as the battleground. And a lot of my people will die, but they'll be free. And so you start to see this part where we're building it back up to make it less gray, to kind of go from gray, morally gray, back to white. And then you start to see that, oh, actually, Alessan is going to be a much better man than Brandon. He's going to be so much better than Brandon. Absolutely. Alessan is not the type of man who's going to kill and murder and torture all of his people. But then at the end, you also realize that, holy cow, it makes sense. We've been looking at Brandon from Dionora's perspective, and she's in love with him. So, of course, we don't actually have we thought we were getting an accurate perspective of him, but it's not the case. We're actually getting something completely different from this one. And this kind of talks about what I wanted to highlights the whole thing that I want to talk about, which is manipulating the audience. This is what the story is about, and kind of how Kay is able to do this. And it's really, really powerful. So it's just one thing I wanted to highlight and kind of talk about this story, because it's not something that I see very often. Very often it's kind of much more of just very straightforward. There's no gray, there's no pulling the audience here or there or anything like that. It's just kind of, most stories just go very straightforward, and this is something that I was really, really impressed by. So yeah, that's all I have for today. I hope you guys enjoy this one, and I will see you in the next.